Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Richard Fontaine. I'm the president of the Center for New American Security. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to celebrate the publication of CNAS Senior Fellow Tom Ricks' new book, The Generals, American Military Command from World War II to Today. Speaking of books, it'd hardly be a launch event if we didn't have some for sale, and we do. So if you're interested, Tom's volume will be on sale after the event, if you haven't already picked up one, which I see some of you have, in the ballroom lobby. Tom Ricks has been a member of the CNAS family for quite a while. Serving as a senior fellow at the center, Tom writes a widely read blog for foreignpolicy.com called The Best Defense, which won the 2010 National Magazine Award for Best Blog of the Year. He's well known for his book Fiasco, The American Military Adventure in Iraq, and for its follow-up, The Gamble, General Petraeus and the American Military Adventure in Iraq. Tom spent 17 years as a reporter covering the U.S. military for the Wall Street Journal and another 8 on the same beat for the Washington Post. In the course of this work, he reported on military activities in places as varied as Somalia, Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and he's been part of 2 teams that won the Pulitzer Prize. As I've gotten to know Tom over these past few years, I've learned that he's that rarest of finds, a disruptive thinker, as we like to say, whose energy and intellectual creativity combine in novel ways of thinking. He constantly pushes us at CNAS to think differently, in new ways, more nimbly and more provocatively. And that's a spirit that infuses Tom's new book, The Generals. In it, he explores generalship, both good and bad, and accountability. He traces the history of generalship from George Marshall in World War II through O.P. Smith at Chosin Reservoir in Korea and William Westmoreland in Vietnam, to Colin Powell in the Gulf War and to the generals who commanded in Iraq from 2003 on. The Generals argues that the military has changed over the years in the way it rewards good generalship and punishes bad, and that the gulf between performance and accountability has grown ever wider. Tom's is a provocative argument, and one that we will examine in some detail in tonight's conversation. Joining Tom in this conversation is Susan Glasser, one of the nation's top national security journalists. Susan's the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine and has done truly tremendous work in building foreignpolicy.com into a key locus of the national security discussion. Prior to joining Foreign Policy, Susan was a reporter for the Washington Post and for the Capitol Hill newspaper Roll Call. She brings great experience and expertise to this conversation tonight. With Tom and Susan, we're poised for an illuminating and intriguing conversation about leadership, generalship, command, and relief. Tom and Susan, over to you.
First of all, thank you so much, Rich, for that kind introduction, and a big thank you to CNAS, which has not only been a benefactor to Tom, but directly and indirectly has been a huge supporter of foreign policies as we've embarked on this project over the last few years. So thank you very much. And I think you've given us a perfect starting point for the conversation today in your very generous and I think right on the mark introduction of Tom and his new book, because I too have known Tom both as not only his editor and also his friend, but as a disruptive thinker who has lots of important things to say about leadership, followership, and the nature of big institutions. And I think one of the things that I most enjoyed personally about reading The Generals was how relevant it is to thinking about the nature of leadership across many different kinds of large institutions. And also, I think, bringing to the fore these questions about accountability in American public life since World War II, which to me, in many ways, is really what the book is about, as well as being a lot of great yarns about a lot of powerful individual stories, both of the generals we've all heard of, from General Marshall to General Westmoreland, but also those we haven't heard of and whose stories I think need to be recaptured. But I'd like to go ahead and start right in the middle, if you will, Tom. Let's talk a little bit about your most provocative thesis, which is that, boiled down to its essence, there's just not enough firing going on in the U.S. military since the end of World War II.
I would say yes, there is not enough firing going on. But the book is not simply a brief for firing more generals. It is a brief for accountability. If you hold people accountable for success and failure, you incentivize success in the military, and I think we've lost that. There's a real tolerance for mediocrity. As Colonel Paul Yingling famously said about the Iraq War, a private who loses his rifle is punished more than a general who loses his war. And the book is a cry for restoring some of that accountability that George Marshall used in World War II. That Marshall gave generals about 90 days to a few months to either succeed, get killed, or be replaced. And that's why today people like Lloyd Fredendall have been forgotten, and we know names like Ridgway, Gavin, and Eisenhower, the younger officers who were moved up because they were successful in this very hard Darwinian process that Marshall implemented and that we lost in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq.
Well, I'm glad you bring up the example of Colonel Yingling and Iraq, because that clearly is some of the context that informs the book, although it is a real work of history going back to World War II and up to the present day. You make the point that there's more accountability lower down the food chain than for our general officers now. How many?
It's called different spanks for different ranks.
Well, that's exactly right. That's not in the book, I don't think. How many people have been held to account for the disastrous setbacks that the U.S. military had early on in the Iraq War, the failure to see things going on? None, right?
None, really. The stunning thing to me is, here's a good trivia question. Who is the last Army Division commander relieved for combat ineffectiveness? As best as I can tell, it's Major General James Baldwin, commander of the Americal Division in 1971. Since then, generals have been fired, but they get fired for basically taking down their pants at the wrong time in the wrong place with the wrong person. It's a little bit like having tenure for a university professor. You can get fired for embarrassing the institution with moral lapses, but just being incompetent in your profession is perfectly acceptable.
Now, before we get on, and I want you to step back for a second and give people a real sense of why you wrote the book, who the heroes are, who the zeros are. But just quickly first, because this firing thing, that's what really has sort of the insiders in the military establishment really up in arms. You've gotten under their skin with this critique, this idea that the solution is firing. That has prompted some howls of outrage. Why do you think that would make things better? Why is that more accountable?
Because if you tolerate incompetence, you have an incompetent organization. What you want is not to fire people for the sake of firing. You want to fire people who don't succeed. You want to reward people who do succeed. What you want, ultimately, though, is adaptability. I was thinking today about H.R. McMaster, because somebody had written to me and said, Tom, you either have a counterinsurgency army or you have a conventional army. You can't have both. And I thought, wait a second, H.R. McMaster is one of the heroes of the 1991 Gulf War and the most conventional of encounters, a tank battle in the desert, right. The Battle of 73 Easting. Yet, years later in Iraq, he's one of the first commanders to successfully adopt counterinsurgency tactics. That shows a real flexibility and adaptability of mind. It shows the ability to think critically, to think strategically, to be educated about your profession, not just trained for your job. Training prepares you for the known. Education prepares you for the unknown. H.R. McMaster went into Iraq prepared for the unknown. Most of our commanders did not. Most notably, I would say, Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez, who strikingly basically had Iraq blow up in his face and then went home embittered because he wasn't promoted to 4 stars, as if somehow I did my 1 year, I'm entitled to the promotion. That sense of entitlement is a new thing, I think, in the Army among generals, the sense that we are above questioning. I worry a bit that as a nation, we try to honor and support the troops so much that we kind of include the generals in that, not understanding that one way to support the troops is to give them good leadership. They deserve better leadership. They deserve the best leadership we can give them. We are not giving it to them right now.
Isn't one of the arguments is that really we have a much vaster but also more professionalized army than the post-World War I force, that Marshall had an urgent imperative to turn into a real fighting force to begin World War II, and that firing is not necessarily a sign of good leadership or good management of a big organization, but could also reflect a failure, right, in the end of an organization to weed out the problems and let them simply fail upward. So,
sure, but it's never too late to fire a failure. And I think you really want to give people the best leadership you can find. This is a matter of